Glasses up. Hey guys, still enjoying the Winchester Bourbon, finest bourbon that you can purchase for less than $22 at your local emporium or perhaps government-led store, depending on the state you're watching this from. In California, we're really lucky on the alcohol side of things. We can buy alcohol whenever we want. You can go to the grocery store, pick it up.
Until 2 a.m.
Until 2 a.m., yes. But barring those brief hours.
You can't buy alcohol?
No.
2 to 6, right?
Between 2 and 6. So you have to get as loaded as you possibly can before 2 a.m. Go to sleep in your drunken stupor, wake up at 6 a.m. and stagger back.
What's the rationale between not selling alcohol in that 4-hour window?
Well, so that might be a little crazy, and there probably isn't a good reason. What's even crazier is in the South, you can't buy alcohol on Sunday. Or you can just buy beer in some places, or you can only buy it at a
My
restaurant.
father-in-law lives in a dry county.
Yeah.
So you got to drive over the county line to get alcohol.
Right. I went to Salt Lake City, and they just now started selling beer in the convenience stores, but it's very limited, and it's just insane. And like when it's time to lock up the beer, they literally have some of the places. I'm not saying all, but they have chains around the handles of the freezers.
Padlock and
right? Yeah, so people can't go in there. You know what I mean? It's just like we're teasing you until morning. So.
Speaking of obstacles that are not related to drinking, today.
What can be?
What can be? Today we are reading the Ryan Holiday book, The Obstacle is the Way, which is about Stoic philosophy. There is a whole lot of little stories in this book, and I was wondering if you guys had a specific story that stuck out to you. For me, I really enjoyed the Tommy John story. I'm not a big fan of sports by any means, but baseball player, arm was messed up. They told him there's a 1 in 100 chance that you'll ever play again. They do this, he kind of goes, well, if that's the only chance I have, let's do it. Let's roll the dice, and kind of pave the way for this surgery that many other baseball players, I think all the way down to like high school age kids had done. And then he ended up getting caught later on. He was 45 and said, I'm not going to quit, and went to training camp and worked his ass off and kind of kept his career going and had a bunch of other ups and downs. But this book has a lot of stories of ups and downs of relatively famous people. Was there an ups and downs story in that book that stuck out to you guys?
For me, it was the story of Abraham Lincoln. A lot of people, they have this whole idea that he was this great orator. I mean, he was, but they think he had all this great inner strength and, this big strong man, the rail splitter, that whole thing. And they don't realize he suffered from crippling depression. And being all that he had to go through in his presidency, or even in his life, having to learn he educated himself. His father hated him, he hated his father. He had to watch his mother die. And then the one woman that he really did love and wanted to marry died as well. He was engaged to her. And, he went through this series of, after he became a lawyer, running for all these different offices, losing, that kind of thing. He was awkward, gangly, tall, stood out, that kind of thing. But he never gave up. Even though he was depressed, all that he'd gone through in his life, even when it came down to the Civil War, having to deal with that, he utilized all that he had learned and shared it with other people. When other people had to go through something, he always discussed what his life had been like. He came at them with a sense of compassion and understanding. And that's what stood out for me, and I think that's why people ended up liking him, because of all that he could share in his life, all that he had gone through. That's what catapulted him to the level that he was at. It forced him to move forward, and instead of just crawling up inside and giving up on life, it pushed him forward in other ways. And I think that's was the lesson of that chapter, was that even though if you're going through something, you can't let that beat you down. You have to let that be the catalyst to move you forward into what you need to do. And that's what stood out to me. I really enjoyed that story.
I think all the stories in this book I hated equally.
I love the controversial view. So give me
Okay, so backstory. I read this book a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, and I remember I read the first page. I was in Arkansas, and after I was done with the first page, because you told me to read it, I sent you a text message saying, I've read exactly one page and I already hate this book.
And I said, save it for the show because I'm curious. Because this book is more or less a collection of, I don't want to say hard knock stories, but a lot of people that are very successful and the things they've been through. And one would argue that these problems that they solved helped catapult them to success, like Abraham Lincoln. So what's not to like about that? Everybody likes that.
Because I think that there's a lot of revisionist history going on.
Okay.
To retell success stories to fit a particular philosophy. And I'll give you one example. Sure. One of the ones that really stood out to me was the story about Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
And he talks about how Steve Jobs was kicked out of the company Apple that he helped create, but he kept with the Stoic philosophy only to come back years later and help with the rising up of the company. The only problem with that story is that it's 100% false. That Steve Jobs loved to tell that story, but if you read the Isaacson, his official biography, the Isaacson biography, he wasn't kicked out. He was removed from a particular position, but asked to stay at the company, and he left in a huff. And the idea that he was some kind of embattled CEO or founder who was run out on a rail is completely false. He just wasn't exalted quite as high as he wanted to be, and so he took his ball and said, I'm going to go home and you can't play with this anymore. And that's one example of revisionist history where the way the story's told in The Obstacle is the Way is, oh yeah, this guy, he was kicked out of the company he helped start, but he stuck to it, and he kept plowing ahead, and he ended up doing good things later on. That's just, the later on is false, but the process of how we got there, it wasn't Stoic philosophy at all. And so a lot of these stories, I just see a huge sense of revisionist history. And now going back to the last book, or not the last book, but a book we read a couple of books ago, Outliers, the author here, Ryan Holiday, he banks on this great men pulling themselves up by the bootstrap success story a lot, and I don't believe in that story. I think that's a lot of revisionist history, and I think it's a story that some people really like to hear, and that's why some people like this book.
What's funny is you mentioned Outliers, because he does in the first chapter, he talks about the 10,000 hours. And I was just like, wow, what did he read Outliers and then decided he wanted to publish his own, use some of the ideas from there. But revisionist history aside, I think there's some good lessons to be learned. I mean, just the fact that if you see an obstacle, instead of just stopping, okay, how do we get around this? That kind of thing. And I do think there are some of the anecdotes he uses. He simplifies things instead of, like you're saying, telling the whole truth behind, what goes on. But the complaint that I do have about the book is that it seems, in the beginning, he talks about this is not a textbook, this is not a how-to kind of thing. I'm not going to tell you how to get through your problems. We're just going to talk about, these people and how they got around obstacles. The whole book is telling you how to do it, how to go around it. And it's like, he just goes on the opposite of what he said he wasn't going to do. And a lot of the stories seem to be repetitive in their nature, but just with different people.
Yeah. So, I'll tell you, I read Meditations, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations in college, and I didn't particularly like it then, but I like this even less. I still found some value in Meditations. This, to me, it just smacks of, how old is this author? He's like 21 when he wrote this book.
He's under 30. I think he's maybe like 20, 29.
No, I think he's like 20 when he wrote this book. Okay. So you got a really young guy, comes from a privileged upbringing, I imagine him growing up, somewhere in the suburbs of Connecticut, and an upper middle class family, an Ivy League education, probably went to all private schools growing up, and he's going to write at 20 years old about dealing with sufferings with Stoicism. I can buy it from Marcus Aurelius, a man who's 70 and has lived some life. But I can't buy that from a guy who hasn't really experienced life and experienced suffering. Somebody who hasn't, who hasn't walked the full distance. It's like a guy who walks the first mile of a marathon and then sits down and writes a book about how to complete your first marathon. I want to hear from somebody who's 70 years old, like Marcus Aurelius, or I want to hear from a 20 or 30-year-old that's at least endured a lot of suffering and somehow come through that with, via Stoic philosophy.
Right. Well, it kind of reminds me of like my grandfather, and I would sit at the table with him when I was in my early 20s and espouse whatever was the latest philosophy that I had at that time.
You don't get it, Grandpa.
Yeah. I'm 20, I know everything. And he's this man has lived through the Depression. He was in the World War II in the Pacific, and suffered through racism and had a decent life and all that. And he's just reading his newspaper. He doesn't even look up what the newspaper even dropping. He's just like, and constantly he's always said, "You hear the crap that's coming out of your mouth." And it's just, he didn't want to hear all that. That's the funny thing. And he would just let me talk for a while, and then it got to a point where he's just, "Come on, you're being ridiculous." And I think that's the what you get when you're dealing with 20-year-olds. It's like, okay, you have this idea of what life is supposed to be like, and you think that all these they're good stories and all that kind of stuff, but there was a lot of in-betweens that happened, between that time of their downfall that was a catalyst for their success, and you just can't simplify that in these short little chapters in these books.
So I think the stuff that you liked about it, Dan, I also liked, but I think it just boils down to some common sense stuff about when hard things come your way, what are you going to do? Are you going to fold and let it crush you, or are you going to persevere? That seems like that's basically what the book's about.
Right. Yeah, it centers around like three kind of points. It's perception, action, and will. So something bad happens, your perception could be, this stuff only happens to me. Get all whiny and down on yourself, or you can go, well, let me figure out a way to get through this, take some steps to do it, and then kind of push through that hardness. I think what I like about this, and these stories are a little romanticized, it's the beyond the Reader's Digest. It's taking the chapter on Ulysses S. Grant is 3.5 pages that are about half the size of a real book. It's a very little book. You can read this book very quickly. But what I liked about that is I feel like if you look at any celebrity or anyone that's done anything of magnitude, there's an easy way to just kind of put all that aside and just say, well, they just had the perfect parents and they went to the right school and everything just worked out. And I think the reality is the people that we see that are in positions of authority, fame, and success were way more on the hardship side than they were on the silver platter side. Now, this is a generalization. This isn't everyone, but there was some quote from Ray Romano that said something to the effect of, if my parents had paid more attention to me, I probably would have been a great accountant. But now, I think there's some truth to that, because a lot of these guys went through some very rough patches, and I don't, had those circumstances not been present in their lives, they would have just been, if Lincoln had found success early on, I don't think he would have done what he did in history. I think he would have been a great, take your pick, mayor, senator that didn't do anything.
Exactly. Great lawyer, and just call it a day at that. But no, I agree with you. I think that hardship builds character, and it's going to do one or two things. It's going to either push you forward, or it's going to totally break you down. And these are stories of people that just decided that they were going to do something about it. Now, there's a chat when he talks about will, I kind of disagree with it. I think that's the whole young aspect of his mind, is that he's saying that will is not from within. Will is just acquiescing and dealing with, okay, I was dealt a bad thing, but I'm not going to let it set me back. No, people, your will plays a whole lot. And whether or not you're going to move forward, with these things. So I think he's kind of skewed in some of his thinking when it comes to that. But I did like the first part when he talks about the difference between observation and perception, because oftentimes what you perceive isn't the truth. What you observe and see in front of you, oftentimes is, I'm not going to say it always is, you know, because you can be fooled by things, by what you see when you walk in on a situation or see something. But
to me, that doesn't seem like you need Stoic philosophy, you need to read a book. You just kind of need a good parent, a good mother or father to, you know, when you're a kid growing up, to say, okay, the situation seems bad, but let's put it in perspective,
right.
you know. How bad is it really? You know, and you develop that kind of skill of, I don't know, putting things in perspective, basically.
Well, you know, it all depends, because like I was saying, I was raised by my grandfather's house, and he wasn't he was a very intelligent man, brilliant, but he wasn't a great explainer. If I was going through something, he was kind of like, you know, why don't you get over it? You know, that kind of thing. But he knew that in time that I would see for myself. That was him helping me to grow. I mean, he would say a few things in between there, you know, what I was going through in the end. But his whole thing was like, eventually, you have to get over it. That's just all there is to it. And now I kind of see where he's coming from. You know, a lot of people don't have, you know, the explanation there for them. You know, a lot of parents deal with things differently, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the generation my grandparents grew up in, being children during the Depression, having to suffer World War II, you know, with rationing, income tax of 92%, and dealing with racism in certain situations, you know, and that kind of thing, and making their way in the world. And, you know, for them, emotions wasn't...
It was low on the priority.
Yeah, it was low on the priority.
Yeah.
It's like, you're going to have to push through that. You know, that kind of thing. So I guess it depends on your perspective. You know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is their perspective was filled with hardship, right? I
Right.
mean, whereas I would say, I'm 31, you're 30 and change, right?
36.
36, how old are you?
46.
So we're relatively close in age, but I would say the generations before us had far more natural hardship in terms of just growing up, even regardless of socioeconomic status.
You know, I was thinking about that because I was thinking, even Marcus Aurelius, who, for the standards of his time, lived a very comfortable, posh lifestyle. By the standards of our time, he lived with a lot of hardship, lived an uncomfortable life, you know, constantly traveling to the battlefront. Travel was hard. It was nothing like hard to get, like, oh, I've got some jet lag, I gotta sleep an extra hour in the hotel room. No, it was really hard. So I think even the Emperor of Rome dealt with some hardship and physical hardship and some depravity, or, you know, not getting everything you want, not having comfort in a way that we're not familiar with.
Right.
So I give him a little more credence when he talks about Stoic philosophy than I give. Again, you know, I always come back, I just don't like this author. Okay, so you know we don't say we like everybody, or at least I don't say I like everybody.
We're honest here.
You know.
Yeah.
I don't like. So let me tell you one other thing. I read the Kindle book and I listened to the audio book, and there's this thing called Whisper Sync where they sync them up. Well, in the audio book, there's an epilogue that's basically a dialogue between Ryan Holiday and Tim Ferriss. Are you guys familiar with?
Yes, because Tim Ferriss got the audio rights to this and produced the audiobook. I have not heard it. So what?
So they have an interesting conversation. But when Tim Ferriss talks, I feel like he wrote the 4-Hour Work Week, which is it's a very narrow domain of knowledge, and it's about this particular way of looking at life and organizing your life. And if you want to do that, that's great. And I feel like he has all the authority in the world that he needs to have to say that. But when Ryan Holiday is talking about a particular philosophical approach to life in general, I feel like, who is this guy? Who does he think he is writing this stuff? I just feel like he hasn't lived life enough to say this really works. Does this philosophy work to keep you married for 50 or 60 years till death do you part, through all the ups and downs of marriage? Does this philosophy work for raising children and all the ups and downs and the sleepless nights and the heartaches? Does this philosophy work, you know, to help you through your career? You know, I want to talk to the 70-year-old retired version of Ryan Holiday and say, now tell me what you really think about this philosophy. Not a guy who's 20 years old and producing a lot of conjectures about how this is going to work in the real life, in the real world.
Right. Well, I mean, the older you get, the more you realize that, there's a difference. I mean, between the time I was 30 and 46,
It's a big move.
it's a huge, breadth of knowledge I've gained in between here and that time, just from life experience and, that kind of thing. That's not saying that some people that are young aren't wise. I mean, there's sometimes when, I deal with, one of my kids, and they can see the obvious, why are you doing that? You're not supposed to be doing that. Why are you texting and driving? That kind of thing. Not that I text and drive. But,
Yeah.
it's just one of those things. I think younger people do have some sort of clarity, but I think when you get to an age, between 13 and 25, all that's muddled up. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're talking about, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think it was a good effort to put some historical things together to just basically write a book.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That kind of thing. And I think that in some ways, the way he put it together, he was on the right track, but I think it gets repetitive. Like I said, after a while, it's just different people in the same situation.
Yeah.
How many times do you have to tell them the same story? But I get what you're saying, is just who am I going to go talk to? Am I going to go talk to this man who's older than me that has life experience? Or, am I going to go talk to, just some cat hanging out on the corners,
So let me say this, and then I'll end my rant.
Yeah, it's okay. It's kind of funny.
I actually think that he's right about a lot of stuff, despite the stories not being accurate. Plato I respect a lot. He tells these myths, these fictional stories, and then he says these things are not true, and we know they're not true, but they help us understand something. So even though he gets some of the facts wrong, they're useful. I think he's right about a lot of stuff, but I think he's accidentally right. I don't think he's right because he's lived life and has experience and has knowledge. Somebody who, if I ask you a multiplication question, what's 8 times 8, and you don't know your multiplications at all, but you happen to guess 64, you wouldn't say you have knowledge.
I see. Yeah.
Right? So that's why I feel like this guy's so much of the book is good, and actually it did help me as a reminder about a lot of things, but I feel like the author was accidentally right and accidentally helpful, despite his total lack of life experience and, any qualifications to speak wisdom into the life of other adults.
Interesting. This book is very much what we've talked about. We're not hiding anything or twisting anything. This is literally a collection of hard knock stories, and it gets a little repetitive. I think there's some good things to be gleaned in this book.
Oh yeah, so you said you liked it a lot. I'd
I
like
did.
to hear from you. You said, because I remember when I sent you that text message that said, I've read one page and I hate this book. You said, well, you said something like, I really liked it. It was really, you said it was really motivational for me. So read it and we'll talk about it when it's done.
We're almost out of time, but I will say this. I feel like if you read this book, I was reading this before I go to work, and it's very encouraging because a lot of people that were struggling with something and found a way to overcome it. And if you're doing, before I left for work, I've got a whole day's worth of problems ahead of me, problems to solve at work, problems to solve at home, paying bills, all of the things that everybody struggles with. I think kind of started the day out with 10 minutes of this book. Put a nice little shimmer on my day. So yeah, I would say Brian's probably a not so much check this out, or would you tell people to check this out? What do you think?
Man, I don't know, because I think it actually did do me some good, even though I have a little bit of a distaste for the author. I'm a toss-up. I don't know. Yeah, read this book. It might do you some good.
Aaron, would you recommend people read this book?
Okay, I would recommend it on the sense that it is somewhat motivational. There are some good stories in it. It gets a little mired down in the repetitiveness of the stories. But like I say, it's kind of one of those things where it kind of gets to the chicken soup of the soul kind of thing. And
which we're reviewing next week, Chicken Soup of the Soul.
Great book, Jack Canfield.
Right. I want to read the Chicken Soup of the Black Soul. I don't know.
Yeah. Next
But
week, week after that.
Right. Okay. But they're motivational. They're good. I enjoyed some of the stories. I just don't think it had to be repeated a lot. Make some good points. So yeah, for somebody who's going through something, okay, read it, glean from it what you can. You have an obstacle. Check your options out. Don't give up. That kind of thing. But just take it for that.
I would say this is great. If it's been a while since you've picked up a book, this book is very accessible, and you can read through it quick. But also, let's say you've only got a 5 or 6 minute break or some kind of short amount of time. There's a lot of stuff packed into a short amount of time. I don't know if this book has the potential to change your life, but I think it's got some very basic and general tools that will help you solve problems, and at the very least, show you a way to look at problems in a different light. I think we don't have the same hardships our great-grandparents did or the Emperor of Rome did. I think we leave our air-conditioned cars for the 8 steps to our air-conditioned offices, sit down, and
But it's really uncomfortable between the
those
car
8 steps in Southern California. It's been like 90 degrees, and let me tell you, it's dry heat too. Those 9 steps into the office, I can hardly bear it. I'm almost sweating. So I think this helps put a lot of things into perspective, especially, arguably the majority of challenges that we face on a daily basis are not life and death. They're kind of stupid little problems that in the grand scheme of things, not that big a deal, but they feel the potential to feel like, oh my gosh, this is such a big deal. And it's not. Thanks so much, guys. We'll be back soon with more great episodes.